Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. I am Tigress Osborn. I'm the executive director of NAAFA, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, and welcome to the NAAFA Webinar Series. Our guest today is author Virginia Sole-Smith. She is the author of Fat Talk, Parenting in the Age of Diet Culture, and she's going to tell us about her previous book, and we're going to talk about her other projects. But before we get into it with Virginia, just a couple of NAAFA notes. For those of you who are new to NAAFA, we have been working on fat rights on our mission to change perceptions of fat and to end size discrimination since 1969. We do that work today through educational programs and community building programs like the one that you are here for today, our NAAFA Webinar Series. We also have a fashion series hosted by Marcy Cruz, and there'll be a new episode of that coming out later this month as well. We do lots of other kinds of virtual events with our friends at Drag Storytime and with performers from Fat Community and all kinds of fun things. And we are also the co-founders of the Campaign for Size Freedom, which works to change civil rights laws to include height and weight as a protected class under the law. You can learn more about other stuff that we do by following us on social media at NAAFA Official, or by visiting our website at naafa.org, NAAFA.org. We are joined today by our friends from Pro Bono ASL. Our interpreter today is David. We encourage you to support Pro Bono ASL in their important accessibility work. September is also Deaf Awareness Month, so we encourage you to find and support deaf creators. Of course, we love it if you find and support some fat deaf creators, and we're going to give you some tips about that later this month on our social media. So again, follow us, follow Pro Bono ASL, and help us support our friends in that community. And I think that with no further ado, I should bring on our special guest. Virginia, can I ask you to introduce yourself to the NAAFA webinar community?
Yes, absolutely. It is such a delight to be here. Thank you, NAAFA, and thank you, David, and everybody who's working on this. So I am Virginia Sole-Smith. I am the author of Fat Talk, as Tigress said. My first book was called The Eating Instinct, Food Culture, Body Image, and Guilt in America. And then my main gig these days is I write the Burnt Toast newsletter and host the Burnt Toast podcast. And together, Burnt Toast is an anti-diet fat liberation community where I do a lot of reporting on all of these issues, and we have kind of endless ongoing conversations about dismantling anti-fatness and navigating diet culture, particularly for parents, but definitely not exclusively for parents.
And you're not kidding when you say endless, because you have a really interactive Burnt Toast community. So
We
they're
do,
at it
yes.
all the time, right?
We do. We have really robust comment section, which is an absolute joy, especially as someone who has plenty of experience in other kinds of comment sections, which are less kind and supportive. And yeah, I think it's a place a lot of folks come to as they're beginning their own work on, maybe eating issues or body, except, their kind of own body work. But then very quickly, they start to understand the broader framework of this is a systemic form of oppression, and we're working on liberation here. And it's really cool and kind of endlessly rewarding to see people kind of take that step and start to reframe the work and yeah, and where they go with it.
Well, let's start by talking a little bit about your process, what your process was like of going from I don't know anything about body liberation stuff to being the host of a podcast that talks about these issues as systemic issues. How did you get started in this work?
So I come from the dark side. I was a women's magazine editor and writer for a long time. Um, and I will say, I began that career, this was the early 2000s, very different moment for conversations about bodies for sure. But I certainly began that career with a clear feminist agenda. I wanted to be working in women's media, helping conversations happen about women's bodies that weren't happening. And then very quickly realized that the problem with corporate women's media is you can't really have those conversations because the, Glamour, Marie Claire, Harper's Bazaar, all those places are completely beholden to beauty and diet advertising. So I was in this position of how do we talk about this stuff and also, like, keep making the magazine. And I spent a lot of years writing diet articles, writing, how to get your best body, writing things I also felt really good about. We would always be doing stories about date rape or about, other issues that really mattered, of course, but, definitely causing a lot of harm. And, I hate to say it, but for me, it did take becoming a parent to have a real moment of reckoning around, you know, this discomfort that I think I had allowed myself to live with of like, this doesn't feel right, but I don't really know what else I would do or how this conversation would change. I had to have the clarity of, I don't want to pass this on to my kids. I have
Mm.
two daughters, well, one daughter, one non-binary kid. And, I don't want to pass this on to either of them. And so that was a real crucible moment for me. And then, the other piece of it is my older daughter went through a lot of really intense medical ordeals as a baby and completely stopped eating and became dependent on a feeding tube for 2 years. So for that experience in particular, even though it has nothing to do with fatness, it kind of forced me outside of this mainstream paradigm where I started to realize, and really challenge a lot of ableism I had held, a lot of expectations about being the quote perfect mom and realizing how much of that I had tied up in food and bodies in really toxic ways. And that was sort of the thing that opened the door for me and started me down this different road.
How old are your daughters now? Or sorry, how old are your two children now?
They are 11 and almost 7.
And how much do they know about your work?
Probably more than they would like to. These are rich and ongoing conversations in our house. I think, it's interesting. My older daughter, she's a tween. She has to be really mortified by my existence most of the time. That's her
Practically a
work.
requirement at that stage of their
Yeah,
life.
no, it's her work to do. It's important work to do. But I can see when there are these kernels, like she read Fat Talk and she was like, well, I skipped all the boring parts where you talked, but I really liked the parts with the kids in it. And I was like, yeah, that seems right. But I see her starting to navigate in middle school, friends talking about diets, this stuff coming up. And she definitely has a different lens. And I'm kind of curious to see where that takes her. And then my younger kid is basically mad they are not fat and is looking forward to becoming fat one day and just really feels like they're a committed fat activist who is in the wrong body right now, which is sort of adorable and charming.
You've really forwarded the fat agenda. It's our whole,
Yeah,
I talked a little bit about our mission, but of course our true mission is to make everybody else in the world fat because that's what
yeah,
we
yeah,
do.
yeah. But no, I mean, we talk a lot about all bodies are good bodies, even your thin body, it's all good. But they really, I mean, both my kids are pretty quick to spot this stuff when they encounter it in the world in school. So I'll hear, they'll come home and say, like, the teacher said such and such, or, and it's fun. I mean, the funny part of it is they also use this against me. Like I regularly hear, I don't have to brush my teeth because my body belongs to me, or I don't have to brush my hair because that's you trying to control my body. And I'm like, we could have a little less body liberation, a little more hygiene maybe, but it's pretty awesome actually.
Well, but talk about that whole way of approaching parenting where you are creating the idea that kids truly have body autonomy, even though they're kids. Because, like, a lot of times we talk about that as though kids have body autonomy when it comes to other people touching them. And then
Yeah.
everything else, I am their parent and they do what I say in all the times and all the ways, regardless of what they want to do. Right. And that's
Yes.
not quite your approach.
No, it's not because I really think if we are trying to raise kids with this fundamental sense of body sovereignty, right? Their body belongs to them, their body is for them. We do have to respect their ability to set limits even when and say no, even when they set those limits and say no to us. So my feeling is, at the family dinner table, if you say no thank you to the broccoli or to the entire dinner I've just worked hard on to make, like, that's frustrating for me as someone who's just done the work of getting dinner on the table, but if I can respect that no, you now have that in your like in your psyche, in your DNA, you know that your no needs to be respected. And I think as we, as kids get older, as they get into situations with peers, as they get into romantic relationships, I want them to know that their no is a complete sentence and that it really matters. So I think, yeah, we often hear this stuff about like telling kids they don't have to hug Aunt so and so or Uncle so and so. Absolutely. My kids, believe me, no, they don't have to hug anyone they don't want to. That is important, but we have to respect their boundaries too and let them make those decisions and understand that it's kind of it all intersects. If you feel like your body a little bit belongs to somebody else or a little bit has to exist for somebody else, how are you going to navigate the gymnastics coach who's, really abusive, or the boyfriend or the girlfriend? Like, there's just so many situations ahead of them where that knowledge, it's not going to prevent it because the world is the world, but it's going to help them navigate the world very differently.
Well, and even in some of those conversations about you don't have to, hug Uncle John or whatever, I feel like those are still relatively new conversations too.
Yes.
And we had a sort of clear line about what we thought was inappropriate touching, and
Yep.
what's obviously inappropriate touching. But when it came to like, oh, but I told you to hug grandma, that there
Right.
was, kind of a different line. And it seems like, like you really champion just like full autonomy. So you've mentioned one way that that gets challenging at your own dinner table when you've made the
Or
broccoli
br
and eat
teeth
it, or
brushing, yes.
yeah. Yeah. That seems to be one of the touch points where, or one of the flashpoints rather, where other people get really mad at your work.
Yes, I am known on the internet to some extent for being the fat mom who buys all the orange snack crackers, and it is true. In my house right now, there are Cheez-Its, Puffy Cheez-Its, Goldfish, and Ritz crackers, and they are available to be consumed by children and adults, as people wish. Um, the thing that I think is important to understand about this conversation is, of course, as a parent, we still have to give our children limits and boundaries. That makes kids feel safe. They are not developmentally ready to do all the grocery shopping, to plan the meals, to execute. They don't have the executive function for this, nor should they. So, of course, there is structure to how I parent my kids. Of course, there are limits on being unkind to people, or, it's not that it's just like, I think there's often a vision that what I'm talking about is like, if you give a child body autonomy, there will then be an endless free for all in your house.
Right? They'll just
And
be feral.
right, they'll just be feral and they'll just be eating whatever they want all day and never going to bed and like rude and da da da. Da. And I think that just speaks to our fear around this, and particularly our fear around food and bodies. We are so afraid of what will happen if children are in charge of their own bodies, if children have this sense of autonomy, because we are so afraid of what will happen if anyone who's not in the idealized, quote, normative body has body sovereignty. So it's really that fear coming up. So yes, there are snack crackers in my house. I'm going to make brownies later today because they're coming back from their dad's house. And that's one of our, coming back to mom's house traditions, is that we have brownies. And there are also times when I say, "This is what's for dinner. You don't have to eat it, but no, we're not going to get something totally different out of the cupboard. This is your option. There'll be a bedtime snack later if you don't like what I've served." And I put a lot of effort into making sure there are a few options on the table that I know they can eat, even if it's not their favorite thing. And sometimes that is puffy Cheez-Its, because I'm thinking, well, I made curry and I'm the only one of the three of us who wants to eat that. So let me do a snack plate with some other options. Um, but that's not the same thing as saying, like, you can just totally reject this and go get what you want and there's no boundaries. And so I think all of that is very destabilizing for those of us who came up in diet culture, whose family dinner tables were steeped in diet culture, and in just a more traditional mode of parenting, of like parent as ultimate authority and children as compliant. And if we're trying to cultivate something different, then we have to understand that that is not going to look like total compliance all the time. And that's them asserting their right to be individuals and have preferences. So it can be hard to articulate that nuance for people. But what I come back to over and over for myself is, I want family meals to be a place of safety and connection for us. And that matters more to me than what gets eaten or doesn't get eaten. And so if I have to modify the menu, or if I have to serve food differently to create that connection and safety, that's the real goal I have, not how much broccoli did they eat.
And I think that's also just sort of how I feel about wanting to approach other humans in the world, because we
Yes,
often don't offer that same kind of compassion to other adults, and especially to fat adults. Like, one of the things that you're
absolutely.
talking about allowing people to have body autonomy, um, we often treat fat bodies as though they are public bodies and they are everyone's business, not just the person who's living in that body.
Right.
Uh, and
That's right.
I'm sure you see some of these parallels now as you're working with, as you went from being a journalist. I don't know how much contact you had, like, directly with your readers as a journalist in the way that you have with your
Yeah.
listeners. You're doing the Burnt Toast podcast. Can you talk a little bit about that, about like how folks have reacted to your work, not just as parents, but just as, as adult humans with their own body stuff?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. When you write for mainstream media outlets, you have a sense of who your reader is, but it's mostly defined by the marketing department. So it's like, my reader is a 36-year-old woman who needs outfits that go from day to night, which turns out is not a need any of us have ever had. But the women's magazines believed differently back then. But so it's very abstract. You kind of have this idea of who you're writing for, but she's not a real person. Now that I write this newsletter and do the podcast and run this community, my readers are in my email and my comments and my DMs all the time. We're in this constant conversation. I know that, I mean, I know some of them super, super well, but I definitely know the kind of demographics and who's coming to me really well. And yeah, it's really interesting because I have this opportunity to learn from my audience all the time, from the community that I'm in, which is something that mainstream journalism is not very good at, right? I mean, there's like the letter section or the comment section, but the rule that you get told in mainstream journalism is like, as the author, you don't engage with that. You've published the work, you let it stand, and the audience does what it does. And to be honest, in mainstream journalism, that's a form of self-preservation, because those comment sections can be toxic cesspools and it wouldn't benefit you personally to be in them. But in Burnt Toast, we're in community together. So if I get something wrong, they hold me accountable and I learn from them and do better. And that is a huge gift that I've experienced. And so, yeah, so to your question of like, what are people getting out of the work? I mean, I certainly do hear from parents talking about how it's helped them navigate going to the pediatrician's office or buying school clothes, all these moments where anti-fatness shows up in a child's life. But I often regularly hear from folks who aren't parents who say, this is helping me reparent myself, or this is helping me think about how to show up for my nieces and nephews, or the young people in my life in whatever context. And I think, again, it goes back to that transition we were talking about, where we start with doing our own work, and then we start to understand the larger framework. And I think that's the moment of learning that I'm just obsessed with watching people, that changed everything for me. And then I'm obsessed with watching other folks make that leap, because that's when you start to see, this is work. This is a gift to myself to do this work, but also I can be part of making real change here. Like, I can be part of moving the needle forward on these conversations. How can I be an advocate in my own life? Which is, of course, why I'm such a huge fan of NAAFA, because you all are leading the charge on that every day.
Well, thank you for that. And I know that your community is also really active, not just in dialoguing around the content of your podcast, but also in moving some of what they've learned out into real world action. Are there some examples of that you feel particularly proud of?
Well, one that's a little bit of it seems like a little bit of a tangent, but it's not a tangent. Is we every year we raise money for a nonprofit called the States Project, which works to transform state legislatures, turn them democratic, so that we can start actually making real change state by state. And the reason I picked this organization is because so many of the issues I care about, gun control, abortion rights, reproductive freedom, all of these things get decided at the state level. And of course, as I don't need to tell you, Tigress, like, any chance we have that, anti-weight discrimination laws is happening at the city and the state level as well. Like local government is where we are going to start to enshrine fat rights in the first place. So every year we raise money for a different state with, this organization does the work on the ground of figuring out which state legislatures can we make a real impact in, and the readers vote and we pick one to raise money for. Right now we're working on North Carolina. Last year we did Virginia, and the year before that, Arizona. And obviously these are all states where things are not perfect.
Oh, I live in Arizona.
Yeah,
So I know.
But even just flipping one seat of power there can start to make a difference in what laws get passed, in what the far right is able to do to keep stripping away at, trans rights, reproductive rights, all of these things. So that's probably the most like tangible, I can put dollars amounts to it. But on smaller levels, I hear a lot from teachers who are doing things like looking at the books in their classroom and making sure that there are books with fat protagonists, not the sad fat kid, not the villain or the bully, but actually like fully fleshed fat characters so that kids will have that representation. Or, my favorite is hearing from health teachers. Oh my Lord, because health curriculums are an absolute mess and just full of anti-fatness on every level. And hearing from health teachers who are saying, you know what, I am rethinking how we teach nutrition this year. I am rethinking, we are not going to talk about BMI, we are like, all of that is huge. So those are some, kind of tangible things. And then I think the last one does go back to that personal work, but I love hearing from folks who are like, I figured out how to have a conversation with my dad about this, and I haven't been able to do that before. So that felt good. I figured out how to set a boundary with my mom or my husband. I mean, those are huge victories for people.
I want to just emphasize for folks who are new to NAAFA, who are with us today, that the campaign for size freedom does work, as Virginia says, on a state level and on a city level. Most notably, we did some work last year in New York City, which made it the most populous, in the United States to have any kind of civil rights protections related to body size. And if you are interested in supporting that work, or even just interested in finding out when we're working with local organizers where you are, on our website, there is a petition for the campaign for size freedom, and it allows you to opt in to contact with us. If folks start organizing where you live, that we will let you know and make sure that you are informed about that. So please do join us in that work. And Virginia, I promised people in the description of this event that I would ask you to help us understand what burnt toast has to do with diet culture. How'd you get to the name? How did you get to the name of your podcast?
That is a great question. So the backstory on the name Burnt Toast is, number one, if I'd known Burnt Toast was going to become what it is today, I probably would have put a little more thought into the name. But so prior to launching Burnt Toast, I co-hosted a podcast with my best friend, Amy Palangian, who is a kid food blogger, and probably kid food blogging is a niche that's like rife with diet culture and unrealistic expectations about motherhood. And Amy is one of the few people I know doing it with so much integrity and really trying to like help parents get dinner on the table. And yes, it's okay to use ketchup and bag salad and the things that make your life easier, as opposed to like make it all from scratch and have it be perfect. So we hosted a podcast together. This was like going back like 2019, like years ago. And when we were brainstorming names for that, I really wanted to call it Burnt Toast because it was going to be a podcast about like food and motherhood, and burning the toast is like a sort of classic thing I do in the morning when I'm crazed and trying to get my children together. But it was taken at the time. So we ended up calling that podcast Comfort Food, but the name kind of stuck with me. And when I was naming then the community that is now Burnt Toast, I decided to go back to it. One, I just think it's very memorable. It's a sticky name, so that's always good branding. But I also, I like that it's carbohydrates, my favorite maligned food group. I like that it contains gluten. Not no shame to anyone who has genuine gluten issues, of course, but the diet culture around bread is pretty dark. And I like that there's still a lot of imperfection in it because, this is the work of navigating how we live in our bodies, how we parent our kids around bodies and food is always going to be imperfect and messy. And yeah, I like that it sort of nods to that.
I love that. Do you still eat the toast if it's burnt?
Oh yeah,
What's your
I actually think
burnt
burnt
toast
toast
story?
tastes better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it better burnt toast. I mean, my children, no, it has to be lightly and evenly toasted. And if there is any hint of excessive toasting, it is sent back. But that's that body autonomy we were talking about. um, but then there's more burnt toast for me. So,
I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to Lavender, who's joined us as our second interpreter. Hi, Lavender. Thank you for
hi,
being
Lavender.
um and I just want to let folks who are here with us live, not watching this later on YouTube, know that if you have questions for Virginia, you can start putting those in the chat. In the meantime, Virginia, let's talk a little bit about your first book, and how you got from there to here.
Sure. So the first book really came out of that experience that I was talking about in the beginning, where my older daughter stopped eating and we were forced to figure out, you know, what does it look like to help a child feel safe around food and recover from that? Is recovery even the goal? And really challenge, again, so much of the ableism that I had around food and how we feed our babies. For moms, in particular, there's just tremendous pressure, both how you're gonna eat during pregnancy to be a, quote, "good mom," and then, of course, the pressure to breastfeed to be a good mom, and, there was a lot of trauma for me in this experience, but I really came out of it with the sense of, like, we need to stop defining motherhood through how we feed our children and through our children's bodies, because we are doing a disservice to absolutely everyone when we do that. It's classist, it's elitist, it's just problematic as fuck. So that really inspired the book. What I will say, and from that experience, what I wanted to do was explore how other biases around food show up in America in sort of lots of different ways. So there are chapters around how parents feed kids, but there's also, chapters around like the alternative food movement, which especially in the early 2000s was a very white dominated, Michael Pollan kind of bougie movement to bring community gardens and organic food to low income neighborhoods. And then when I interviewed the Black moms in low income neighborhoods, they were like, cool, but I'd actually just rather be able to pay rent and have money to go shop at Walmart. And like more food stamps would be more useful than this community garden full of kale. And so it was exploring a lot of the ways that this idea, all of our ideas around perfect eating are really rooted in diet culture, which is of course rooted in white supremacy. And then we kind of mass produce that shows up in places that it really shouldn't be, like fighting poverty or fighting hunger. What I will say about that book is that I was much earlier on in my own radicalization around fat politics. So if I could rewrite that book today, for example, I do use O words in that book because I hadn't yet really grasped the problems with, overweight and obese as in the way that those are actually quite pejorative terms. And there's other pieces of it that I look back on now and I'm like, well, I've come a long way from that, but I think there's still a lot. I still hear from folks who find it a useful starting point. Certainly the personal stories in it are, of course, very close to my heart. And I think that's also part of this work, right? Is being able to say, like, this was close, but I didn't get there. This was wrong. I can do better and continuing to evolve.
When you began writing about diet culture, either as a journalist or working on your first book, how did you explain what that means to folks? The difference between being an individual on a diet and diet culture as a sort of, broader and more all-encompassing thing that we're all part of, even when we're not on a specific weight loss diet ourselves. Like, how do you orient people to that who are brand new to that idea?
Yeah, it's really tricky because, and I think this is something that I got wrong in my early work, to be honest. I was more focused on how do I get women to stop dieting? Like that was the goal. How do I stop dieting myself? How do I get women to stop dieting? That was kind of my starting point with this work. And I think that came from, again, having been in women's magazines, realized I'd done a lot of harm and wanting to undo the harm and like get, help women think, in particular women, think differently about food. But it's really not about our personal choices around what we need to do to feel safe existing in our bodies, right? That, that was honestly like to say to someone, stop dieting, you can eat whatever you want, is like almost another version of diet culture because it's still coming in as this outside expert and telling someone what to do with their body and how to eat. And that's what diet culture does. So I had to kind of get to the point of realizing, like, no, we need to talk about this as a system. And now I'm always very clear about that. Diet culture is a system of beliefs we have all been taught from a very young age. And the core belief of it is that if you can be thin and always thinner, you will be healthier, happier, richer, more successful, more loved, and more worthy as a person. And this shows up in our culture in 1,000 different ways. There are the obvious women's media and social media influencers, but it is also in how we talk to our kids at the dining room table, how we talk to our coworkers in the break room about the cupcakes someone brought in. It is all those small moments too. And I think I find when I explain it that way, people have these moments of recognition where they think, oh, yeah, the way I go to lunch with this friend and I feel like I have to order a salad when I'm with her because we just both always have to order salad, and like and everyone skips dessert where we get one dessert and try to split it between 9 people. And it's sad. All of that is us performing diet culture, and it's not that because we are bad people or uncaring people or doing something wrong, it's because we have learned this as a survival strategy in this culture.
Well, and going back to your work with kids, diet culture seeps into schools at a much,
Yes.
much younger age than we think. But we sometimes just think about it as like what the kids say to each other and not the official school curriculums or policies. But there are still schools all over the country that are doing BMI reports to
Mhm.
parents. Denise Hamburger runs a project that's about trying to get schools to stop weighing kids at school. Like that kind of stuff. Jessica says in the chat that her 14-year-old is in ninth grade and has been reporting on all the alarmist and exaggerated claims he's hearing about food and health in his health class. And luckily, the class apparently has a no fat shaming or no body shaming policy, which is something, but still, it's a lot what's going
It's a
on in
lot.
class. And it's rare for there to be an explicit no fat
I know,
shaming
that's actually
policy.
amazing.
Like
It's
that's a miracle.
yeah.
Um, and probably related to certain pockets of places where people are right.
Yes.
Because I don't think that my niece growing up in Arizona in the same school system that I grew, that I was in kindergarten in 45 years ago, is I don't see a change related
Yeah.
to
Yeah, same. Yeah.
um
Yeah, I was just talking to a mom this morning whose 12-year-old came to her and said, my health class is giving me an assignment of we have to take my plate and we have to plan out a 3-day menu of what we're going to eat for 3 days, and we have to count all the calories and put the calorie totals. And I don't want to do this. Can you help me get out of it? And so we were brainstorming how she could talk to the school, like what to put in an email to explain. And it's honestly mind-blowing to me because 12 is the median age of eating disorder onset. Calorie counting is the primary behavior of many eating disorders. And so for the school to have a class that is telling kids for a grade, we need you to learn to count calories is in no way a health promoting assignment. That is actively causing harm. And I have talked to kids for the book and for my work in general. I have heard from many kids that say, yep, this helped me start my first diet. This helped me learn my disordered eating behaviors. I mean, these are really, really dangerous assignments. And I'm always careful with this because I have all the respect in the world for teachers. They work so hard. They do not have enough support. I don't think this is nefarious intentions necessarily, but I do think it comes from this systemic anti-fatness where they're thinking, well, at least if we teach calorie counting, some of them won't end up fat, or the ones who are already fat might lose some weight. And that is the goal, not the fact that we should try to prevent the like most deadly mental health issue for teenagers from starting at this point. Like it's
well and
it's it's so backwards.
well, and when you talk about it being systemic, it's not usually coming from, well, it's not always coming from the classroom teacher.
No,
Sometimes
yeah.
district level or even statewide policy that is all about, quote unquote disease prevention,
Right.
right? And so then it's even more systemic, right? It's even more deeply embedded. It's coming from the government telling us that we need to control our kids in this way.
Yeah, the Center for Disease Control puts out these health edu health education curriculum standards that are kind of the top level of all of this, so it's the federal government, and then it trickles down. States take those standards and they add to them or set them out as objectives for teachers, and then either the teachers or the district curriculum writers have to write curriculums that match the standards. There are ways to meet those standards without including food shaming, body shaming, calorie counting, but it is really difficult because the standards are fundamentally organized around the point of health class is quote obesity prevention. And so
Mm.
if that's the starting point, it's really understandable that teachers are like, yeah, I guess I'll just have them make menus with calories on them. I guess I'll, have them plan a Thanksgiving dinner and tally up all the calories in Thanksgiving dinner. I mean, these are all assignments that I've had sent to me from readers.
It's really remarkable, and then when we're talking about kids, of course, we can't look at systemic impacts on kids without talking about the, recommendations that came out last year from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Right.
And for folks who don't know about that, last year they, recommended some pretty aggressive treatments for fat kids, right? Drugs at much earlier ages,
Mhm.
surgical procedures at much earlier ages, things like that. How do you feel about those recommendations, or how are you here? What are you hearing from the burnt toast community around those recommendations and how parents are navigating that with their pediatricians?
The recommendations are an absolute travesty. I mean, exactly as you're saying, the American Academy of Pediatrics advised pediatricians to start recommending lifestyle plans, which is another way of saying diets, for children as young as 2. They started recommending weight loss medications as young as 12. And we know that the weight loss medication companies are studying them now in kids as young as 6. So I fully expect that to drop. And then referring for bariatric surgery starting at 13. So it's mind blowing to me because, again, we have all this research on how eating disorders manifest at these different ages, how vulnerable these ages are for it. We now have growing research that also underscores that the kids who get eating disorders are not just the skinny white girls who look like Calista Flocker from the after school special that we all grew up with, that they are in fact happening at higher rates in kids in bigger bodies and in very high rates in boys, in trans kids, in, kids of color, et cetera. So the eating disorder epidemic is real and deadly, and to put these guidelines in place that don't take into account any of those risks and how the average doctor might take this, there's a way to talk about a lifestyle plan that I suppose wouldn't promote an eating disorder, but there are many more ways to do it that would be really dangerous for kids. So it's mind blowing to me. And, right away, I started hearing from parents saying, I'm already so stressed out going to my well child checkup with my kid every year. This is making it more terrifying. And I also heard from a lot of doctors saying, I'm scared this is going to make it hard for me to do my job because the problem with those guidelines is if they don't follow them, they're risking, being held up as non-compliant by their practice. They're risking medical malpractice suits. Um, it makes the doctors who do want to change the conversation and weigh kids less and take the focus off weight and meet families where they are and offer the supports families really need around raising healthy kids, like it makes that job so much harder for them. So, what I think is the most disturbing about it is what we're going to see. And I think what we're already seeing is that parents with a lot of resources who can afford to doctor shop, can ask around, can find the doctor, and in certain parts of the country, right? Not everywhere. But you might be able to find the doctor where you can set a boundary and say, I don't want to talk about BMI in front of my child, or find the doctor who's already doing that work. But families without a lot of resources who are also going into a doctor's office aware they're going to encounter ableism and racial discrimination and many other intersecting biases, they are much more vulnerable because if you're already scaling those mountains when you're in the doctor's office, you're not in a position to safely say, don't put my kid on the scale, or no, I don't want your referral to that bariatric program. You're already in a place where you're not safe. So that's where I think we're going to see the most dire consequences of this is for, of course, the people who are the most marginalized.
Well, and doing the civil rights work around size and height, around weight and height, one of the things that we always, want to raise for legislators as an issue is the issue of parental rights and kids being, parents being judged, and in some cases preventing from having their children or prevented from adopting their children or whatever based on their body size or based on their child
Yes.
size. And so when you have the National Pediatric Association saying, it's really dangerous for kids to be this fat, then that's yet another argument that can be made in divorce cases where parents are fighting
Yep.
over the kid, or in, when a teacher thinks the kid is too fat but the parent doesn't, and when the authorities get called, like there's really an even bigger reach than
Yes,
just like
that's right.
an individual kid and their family in their doctor's office. It's like it goes out into all these other, into all these other systems, including the court system.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have seen many cases in the foster system of parental rights being stripped because a child didn't lose weight on like a court ordered diet. And what I think we see even more is a more subtle use of it, where if CPS is evaluating a family and whether or not to place a child in care, the number, like, I can joke about how my trolls don't like my orange snack cracker collection. I'm a wealthy white mom with a lot of privilege. Nobody is coming to take my kids away over this. But, they are going into the homes of Black and brown folks and assessing the groceries and assessing the snack foods and then the child's body size. And they are factoring that into their decisions about whether or not to remove kids from homes. And it is enraging that we would deny people that autonomy around how to feed their families. It is enraging when we are doing so little to make food affordable and accessible in this country that we would factor that in any way is just like, it makes me honestly levitate with rage some days. It really does.
Well, and it's also just always one of those places of like, this is what we're doing,
Yeah.
not not that other stuff that is
Yeah. Yeah.
obviously harming
Obviously
people
legitimate crisis. Yeah.
all the time. Yeah. And I noticed that when you talk to the media in particular, that you are um you're very straightforward in naming your privilege. Can you talk a little bit about how you see privilege working within all this work, and like why it's so important to you to talk about the privileges that you have and how you leverage those privileges to in doing this work?
Yeah. I mean, this is this is sort of the like gallows humor joke of it, but like I'm the palatable white lady that they'll call for the quote, right? Like, and I think that's super gross and unfortunate. And let me, if that's the way, if the system is working, let me name that. Let's talk about it. Let's also make sure we're sharing the platform as much as we can. So often I do turn down a media request and try to suggest other folks who need to be heard on these issues much more than I do. And I think it's always important, I identify as a small fat person. So it's always important to me in especially mainstream media conversations to name that, to explain the spectrum of fatness and how that impacts people's access to care. Because again, we are not talking about how do I personally feel about my thighs. Nobody cares. That's not important. We are talking about how are people accessing healthcare? How are people accessing public spaces? How are people able to live their lives with dignity and respect? And so whenever possible, I'm trying to take the conversation away from how do white ladies figure out how to wear bikinis in our 40s and over to the actual issues that are impacting people's lives.
Is it hard to move the conversation that way?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Every interview starts in the other place, and I try to take it, and some people wanna go there, and, sometimes you'll spend time with a journalist who seems to really get it, but their editor doesn't. So all of that got cut out of the final piece. And
Ooh, oh, I know that
you
one.
know that story. And that is, it's maddening, but that's another reason why I did make the decision to leave mainstream journalism and do the burnt toast community instead, because at least here on my platform, I can make sure the podcast guests are who can I center, who can I amplify, who we can, help the burnt toast community can help bring to a larger audience. So that's a big piece of it. And yeah, I think it's an area where I'm probably constantly getting it wrong and always open to learning and doing better, but I think all we can do is name the privilege that we have, and not just name it, but then also try to push past that and say, "Okay, this is what I see happening. This is where we need to get to."
Is there an example that you have of a time that you got it wrong and your community held you accountable? You mentioned that your burnt toast folks are really good at that. Is there an example that you can share as like, I just want to be clear with our audience, like I'm not asking Virginia to be like self-congratulatory about having figured out how to do it better, but I think that those, like those examples of like, here's a way I messed up and here's how people held me accountable and here's what I'm doing instead can really help other people when they mess up. Do you
Yeah.
have people like that?
Yeah, I think I have so many examples, Tigress. But, um well, I think a couple of things come to mind. There was a piece I wrote recently where I was being critical of Gabrielle Blair, who's a prominent mom blogger and a thin person, who had written a series of articles talking about how great Ozempic will be because it will make us all thin and remove all the food noise. And won't it be so great to live in a world? And it was like a really problematic piece. And so I was kind of walking through, this is where the anti-fatness is showing up. This is a thin person without the lived experience of this, not understanding what this bias really looks like. But I did in the piece make a parallel example where I said, talking to her, a very privileged white woman, I said, you're talking about, wouldn't it be great if we could have a world with no fatness and that would eradicate the bias? On the flip side, like you wouldn't say the same thing about like if we could make all Black people white, we would have erased racism. And I think that's a valid point, but several of my readers, including several Black women, were like, you can't equate those two things. Like that's not the same, those are not on the same level of experience bias. And that's also completely right. And I really appreciated that they held me accountable for not giving that enough nuance and not kind of clarifying where, like it was a point I made and I should have framed it more sensitively and been more aware of that. And so that was a really good moment for me to learn from.
I think that's really common in fat community. That
Yeah.
comparison in particular is that one, and if you did this to gay people, right? Those are people's two go-tos. If you did this
Yeah.
to Black people, you did this to gay people, and sometimes those comparisons are really helpful in getting people to make a connection they wouldn't have
Right.
otherwise made. But
Especially for someone with a lot of privilege. Like
yeah,
for her,
yeah,
I think it might be helpful, but it's not
yeah.
helpful to other communities.
Well, but they're often just wielded so casually.
Yeah.
I once had someone in a less politicized fat community space, but still like a fat space, tell me that I was very lucky to be experiencing racism because at least people knew what that was and they didn't really know what anti-fatness
Oh
was.
no.
And
Oh
I was
no.
like, I'm not sure that's how you want to say that,
No.
right?
No, I
Um,
don't think luck is the word.
lucky it's not, like at least someone recognizes your oppression. Like, and I get,
God.
like whatever, I get the seed of what she was saying, but it was just like, no, you got to think that
No.
one better, boo. Um, but I do think that happens. Those examples in particular happen a lot and have
Yeah.
happened historically in NAAFA spaces, in ways that we're hopefully doing better today.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. And yeah, and I agree with you. I think owning it and saying like talking about getting it wrong is helpful if it helps more of us start to get it right. So yeah, I think that's important.
yeah. What is what is your favorite troll story?
Oh, so many little darlings we could talk about. Um, Yeah, let's think of a favorite.
Well, while you think about it, I will just say for our audience, you are in a space where folks, including the two of us in the interview, have dealt with trolls a lot and have a sort of twisted humor about them as part of our survival
Yeah,
tactics. If it's going to be hard for you to hear a couple of explicit troll stories, this is maybe a time to to take care of yourself by stepping away or just muting. But if you can go with us on the joy of the absurdity of trolls, that's what we're gonna spend a moment on here. Virginia really is one of the most trolled mainstream activists that I see. It's especially again because you are the palatable white lady that they go to, that you don't get some of the trolling that other people who are more marginalized in other ways get in other spaces.
yeah.
But but the flip side of that is like you're in the New York Times and there are some really aggressive that makes people really mad, right?
Really, yeah, it really makes
There-
people mad to see a
there's
fat person in the New York Times.
so mad, so
So
mad.
mad, so mad.
um
Yeah, and I will stick to sort of funnier stories, both just to be mindful of not activating folks too much, and also because I want to acknowledge, because of my privilege, a lot of my stories do. I mean, I have gotten a few like sexual violence threats. I do get some they should take your kids away stuff, but again, I'm very confident no one's going to be able to follow through on that. Whereas for someone else, that would be so terrifying. So I don't get the worst of it that other more marginalized folks get. But what I do get is so what often happens with a big mainstream media outlet is that then there will be ripple effects with other media coverage, which sort of just like keeps perpetuating the troll cycles. So, there was the Fox News guy who spent 9 minutes pulling pictures off my Instagram and making fun of my body. That was not like a super fun one. Um, but uh, yeah, that one's a lot
but it's
such
sort of a badge of honor.
it's it is a point of pride that someone on Fox News was like, we have so much we could be covering, but let's definitely spend 9 minutes talking about how fat this mom is. Like, that's staggering to me. And then, my favorite one is recently the New York Times did a profile on my work. And because of the many intersecting biases that go into that kind of piece, they also talked about my divorce, which somehow seemed relevant to my work as a journalist and fat activist. And in the story, they included an anecdote that's actually in my book and sort of a favorite family story of the time that my younger child ate a stick of butter like it was cheese. And my, at the time, husband and I had a disagreement about whether that was okay. And I was like, butter's on the table. They are too. And butter is basically cheese. Who cares? And he was like, this is so gross and sort of horrified by it. So that's in the book as an example of like how you navigate these moments. And it ended up in the New York Times story. And so then the Daily Mail ran with it. And the headline of the Daily Mail's piece was Fat Activist Divorced Over Butter.
You
Thin,
gotta love
fit husband does not like when fat mom feeds butter to children. And I was just like, wow, it is a game of telephone. That like the nuanced explanation in my book, the way the New York Times wrote it, the way the commenters were all like, I can't believe she let a child eat butter. Like I mean, like this kid doesn't eat butter daily. I want to expect like this was a one funny story. And I think anyone who's met a toddler like gets it. But apparently people haven't.
and
And so
also it wasn't rat poison, like
no,
it's
it was
butter.
butter. It's an actual food. Yeah, it really is. So that's something we've sort of run with as it's a family joke now. I was like, should this Daily Mail headline be our co-parenting Christmas card? I don't know. And I think they frequently give me little gifts like that. Like there's also the troll who described me as the high priestess of the indulgence gospel. And I mean, that's just like a real compliment. Like that's a beautiful thing. So I really took that one, as a badge of honor.
I was featured years ago in a French media story that I actually didn't even know was happening over there. It was like something I had done interviews 4 years before and somehow got, released on TV over there. And I had no idea that there was like a sole Twitter troll for like weeks who was just making these posts about Tigros, which is like tigress, but like as, gross is the French word for fat or
Right,
whatever.
right. So clever. Yes.
Yeah, and so it's like this is amazing. Like there's a one man campaign in
Yeah.
on another continent, and it all consists of calling me a fat tiger, which I'm fine
Which
with.
would be delightful. Yes.
What it's fine. That is so fine. So yeah, that is definitely what I meant by favorites. Like that kind
Yeah.
of stuff that you can still laugh off. Of course, we in no way want to belittle the very, very serious trolling that lots of fat folks get. And especially again, if they are super fat or larger fat people, if they are queer, if they are Black and brown folks, like that all gets, and and you mentioned the threats of sexual violence, like
Yeah.
for women or people who are perceived as women on the internet, that is a whole other element that gets added in. And so always we want to take that seriously, but again, it is kind of a survival skill to
Yeah.
where you can have some levity when it is the ones that are just silly.
So silly. And just so wild that people are spending their free time with giving this much thought to someone they've never met and will never meet and don't actually need to think that hard about. Like that's what really gets me is like how much time and effort. There's a couple guys on like fitness bros on TikTok who regularly make videos about me. And I'm just like, making TikTok videos takes so much time. It's so hard. Like,
I know. I call them the shirtless dude bros of Instagram,
yes.
of YouTube, because there's like this one YouTuber who for whatever reason, just does all his rants. Like, it's his like, do you even lift, bro, or whatever.
Yeah,
It,
yeah.
it- it's yeah. Well,
Amazing.
before we wrap up for the day, is there anything I didn't ask you about that you wish I had asked you that you really would like to tell folks about?
No, this has been so much fun. This has been one of my favorite conversations I've had recently. I always love chatting with you.
Yay, gold star for NAAFA. Woo! Um,
Absolutely.
well, remind folks where they can find you if they want to connect with your burnt toast community, if they want to read or listen to more of your work. Where do we go?
So Burnt Toast is on Substack. It's virginiasoulsmith.substack.com. At some point, I'm going to hook it up to burnttoast.com, but I haven't gotten it together. And I am also on Instagram at _soulsmith. I don't post a ton there, but I'm there in stories, hanging out usually. And then Fat Talk and The Eating Instinct are both available anywhere you get books, at your library, at your independent bookstore, audio, ebook, etc.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. And once again, thank all of you for being with us for the NAAFA Webinar Series today. I am your host, Tigress Osborn, and on behalf of the whole team at NAAFA, we thank you for your support. We are able to provide this and other virtual programmings free to fat community and fat positive people and people who want to become fat positive people, all through the generosity of our donor community. So please, if you are in the position to support us in that way, or other folks who are, connect them with us. Our giving website is open 24 hours a day at naafa.org/give. And we look forward to seeing you for some of our other upcoming virtual events. Please sign up for the NAAFA newsletter or follow us at NAAFA Official on Instagram to see what is coming next. We've got some programming coming up related to Latinx Heritage Month. We've got some other fall favorite events that are in the works. So we'll have news for you about all of those things shortly. And finally, thank you once again to the team at Pro Bono ASL for all of the fantastic work they do for us and out in the community and world to provide this important accessibility. We will see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was such a joy.
Thanks, Virginia.